Greetings, students. I am Dr. Sadri, your instructor for this course, and today we start with Module 11. As you know, we divided our course into three parts. Of the first part of the semester, if you recall, we focus on some of the most basic, concept, notion, background that you need about the politics of the Middle East. And then we had our exam one. So then after that, we moved on to some of the regional issues associated with what? Associated with our geographic region, and we covered those. And then in the third part of the semester, what we have done, is focusing on certain issues. And with Module 11, I'm trying to bring a balance to how courses about the Middle East politics of thought. Because some Middle East politics courses, they focus only on themes the entire semester. And some Middle East politics courses, they focus on countries, and they cover every country in a, one or two sessions. All right. The evaluation that I've got from students throughout the years, because as you know, I've been teaching this course for 2.5 decades, is that right? Has showed that students, they like the themes and they also like the country studies. Now, considering how many countries are in the general area of the Middle East, it's almost impossible to cover all of them and then cover all the themes too. I mean, that would have, can you imagine how much more reading that would add for one course? Okay, so one of the things I did was I tried to put the foreign policy part of it in a new course that I developed called International Politics of the Middle East, INR. It's an INR course, and then it's this course, which is a comparative politics one. I focus basically on the domestic development, and we talk about foreign policy issues that are related really directly to the to the domestic, politics of those countries. Now, as you know, we talked about this one at the beginning of the semester, that we divide this whole large area called the Middle East, that some people, they consider it as far west as Morocco and as far east of Afghanistan. Technically, Afghanistan is not a part of the Middle East, okay? Afghanistan is a part of Central Asia. But anyway, so we have divided into three sub-region, and we did that one because we are looking at it from a perspective of the U.S. foreign policy. Okay, so one sub-region is North Africa, which basically starts with Morocco, one of the first countries that actually recognized United States of America as an independent country, all the way toward Libya. Then the other sub-region is what we call the Eastern Mediterranean. So the first area is called North Africa. Part of the Middle East. Then we cover all the way from Egypt and going all the way up to include Israel, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. These are the countries that the historical term for them was like Levant countries. It's not a politically correct terminology. I think the most neutral terminology for that would be Eastern Mediterranean shore. Okay, so that's what we use for that one. And then, the last but certainly not part of the Middle East, or the third sub-region, would be the Persian Gulf one. So what I did was, because in North Africa, U.S. foreign policy interest is not predominant. If you notice during the, Arab Spring in 2011, U.S. presidents and leadership, they were all talking about, yes, it's an important area, but U.S. is going to lead from behind. And what we did was we allowed our, basically European allies, that they've had a much longer historical connection to that part of the world, which meant, Libya, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, they lead, all right? So U.S. Is interested in the amount of oil which is produced, but the relationship over there is not as significant, okay? Then there is the Eastern Mediterranean area. Eastern Mediterranean area is basically Israel and its neighboring states, okay? We talked about this one under the Arab-Israeli conflict. As you know, Israel, our special ally right there, has a peace treaty with our support, has a peace treaty with Jordan and Egypt, which have the longest border with Israel. But Israel and Syria and Israel and Lebanon, they still do not have a peace treaty, okay? And of course, the other dimension of it is the relationship between the Israeli government and the Palestinians, who are settled in two separate territories of West Bank and Gaza, okay? So here really, contrary to what some people suggest, U.S. doesn't have much of a, economic benefit from it. I know that there are people who argue that we do, but in reality we don't. For us, it actually costs more money because from one side we give a lot of foreign aid. The country that receives most in that region is Israel. Okay. Then second to Israel would be Egypt, and then third to that one would be Jordan. So those three countries actually receive tremendous amount of U.S. foreign policy. So, but this is a different issue. I don't want to get involved in that issue. When I teach IR courses and the issue of foreign aid comes up, I talk about that one, that if you really think about it, U.S. foreign aid is not divided among countries to truly desperately need it. Is that right? Like, for example, what they consider to be the poorest of the poor, countries like Central African Republic or Chad or, Cambodia or something like that. So we basically give foreign aid to countries that we consider to be an ally, or they have a special relationship with us, or maybe they're trying to create peace. So this part of the Middle East actually costs us money as opposed to revenues. The part of the Middle East that we are actually making money is the Persian Gulf one. And that's where we have the most number of, U.S. Bases, okay? In fact, when you think about it, and this is the area, is that right? Persian Gulf area. About 47 years ago, just before Iranian Revolution, Iran was the only country we had two military bases. One in Chabahar in the south east of Iran. That base was basically monitoring the movement of the Russian ships in the Indian Ocean. And Indian Ocean is very significant because it's significant in terms of the international trade, because all the trade from east and west goes back and forth. It doesn't matter which direction. Then the other American base used to be in Iranian part of Azerbaijan. Iranian Azerbaijan, and that one was monitoring the movement of the Russian army in, Caucasus and Central Asia and the other parts. So fast forward to 45 years later, Iran is the only country in that area that doesn't have an American base. All these other countries, okay, they have at least one or two American bases, including Iraq, which we left. And as you know, we have the major base in Assad, base. Assad in Arabic means lion, is that right? We have that one over there, and that has been monitoring activities of if there are Iranian missiles going to Israel or not, or Israelis doing this and that. So we are monitoring everything over there. Okay, and then of course in Iraq, there are other things. There are in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, in UAE, Oman. They all have what? American bases. Again, the other exception would be Yemen. All right. So just wanted to first of all put that one over there for you to present the political map, which political map makes things so easy. Is that right? It colors the countries. You can easily see it right here. Iran is kind of bluish. Iraq is kind of light green. Saudi Arabia is kind of like a, yellowish green, so it shows them where they are and where their borders are, and then you have an idea in terms of their size. Okay, so why Persian Gulf is important? Persian Gulf is important because of what we just mentioned in the previous module, which is oil. Okay, now this is not to suggest that we used to, but not anymore. We used to receive a lot of the oil from the Persian Gulf area because, as you remember, it's the highest quality. Is that right? However, nowadays, it doesn't matter if we receive it or not. Oil is a strategic product, okay? It's a strategic goods in the world. So, and we are like a new modern version of the Roman Empire. So even if we are not using it, we want to make sure that we have some kind of control over where it's produced, where it's going, things like that. Because the world being addicted to oil and natural gas, we want to make sure that nobody was going to damage the Western civilization by preventing the West from receiving it or whatever. You see? So that's where the significance is. The second significance of it is these countries, because they all basically produce oil in addition to some other stuff, they have tremendous amount of dollars. In fact, the oil they're selling leads into what we call petrodollar. So many of these countries are excellent client and customers of American products. You go over there, you see all these American, names of the products, and of course a lot of services, and some of them they even have there, in some of them you can see actually American universities over there. Many American, very prominent American universities have opened up branches over there. So of course, American banks, American insurances, American universities, so those are service part. Then American goods, you see what I mean? From cars to, planes to this and that, they're all over. And they pay cash, and we could use that one. You see what I mean? So that's where, one of our interests is, and that's why one of the, we have so many bases there. So just want to clarify that one. So when I was supposed to choose one of the sub-regions that is important from, again, notice what my bias is. I'm looking at it from our perspective. If I was teaching this class in Europe, instead of Persian Gulf, I would focus probably on North Africa. Is that right? Because traditionally the French and Spanish and British and everybody else, and basically European allies, they would focus mostly on North Africa, which is the closest area to them. Okay, I'm not suggesting the British, they did not have any interest in Iran, Iranian oil, and the Persian Gulf, but that was the closest one to them. Is that right? So in this one, this is what we are going to do. So in Module 11, we have divided it into two parts. Module 11 Part 1, Module 11 Part 2. Module 11 Part 1 focuses on the three major regional powers. And as you can see from their name, is that right? We are talking about Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, is that right? Alphabetically. So nobody gets what? Nobody feels like they're getting special treatment. As you can see, not only their size is large in terms of geography, their population is the highest. Iran has about 80 million, is that right? Iraq has about 30-something million, and Saudi Arabia has about 20-something. You see what I mean? Depending on what statistic you take, because sometimes the statistic on those are actually not very reliable. But the little countries like Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, you see that? Yes, they are very rich, but they don't have necessarily a lot of population, and we will talk about them, the 5 of them, in Part 2. Okay. Having said that, what we need to do is we need to also have a guide in terms of how to follow that one. For that one, I have a PowerPoint for you that we are going to use this PowerPoint for both part of Module 11. We're going to use this one for what? Looking at the regional powers and see how we can look at them in a systematic way. Is that right? And then we would use the same, PowerPoint when we focus on what? On the regional power, on the, minor powers. So first major powers and then minor powers in the region. Does this make any sense? Okay. So having said that one, I spent about 10 minutes right now on this issue. Now what I like to do is I want to go and start with my what? Start with my, outline, and then we go from there, okay? So this outline, obviously, is going to focus on these 3 major powers. Notice that we start with the geographic setting. That's very important. Then we go to the historical one. Then we talk about socio-cultural factors. Then next is the economic condition. Then we talk about the quality of life. Then we talk about political development, then security and military issues. Next is the foreign policy and foreign relation. And last but not least, we focus on what? Prospect for future. So as you can see, and one of the students had actually emailed me and asked, said, Dr. Sadi, you talk about a 5-point scale, but some of the lectures are not 5-point scale or more. Yes, that's right, because it's a lecture, and many of the lectures, they focus on the material that I'm supposed to communicate with you. That 5-point scale we're talking about, you're talking about the essays, okay? An essay is a very, very small version of a scientific work. And as you notice, for example, your postings are not are organized like that too. They also have 5 parts. Is that right? They have first part, second part, third part, fourth part, and what? 5th part. Is that right? So those are the 5 points. So do not confuse methodologically your postings and your essays with the lectures. Is that right? So from a methodological perspective, those of you have already taken scope and method, and I hope that the rest of you take it as soon as possible. Okay. You can look at these, and this is what we call country study. So when we focus on one country at a time, is a country study, okay? You can look at these as these, basically 9 factors are each one like an independent variable. So let's say, for example, we start with, going alphabetically, but with Iran. Is that right? First, we would going to talk about Iran. How does geographic factor affect Iran? How does the historical factor affect Iranian politics? How does sociocultural one you see what I mean? So if you remember in scope and method, we talk about cause and effect, independent, affecting what? Dependent variable. Is that right? Now, notice that I'm setting it up very, very simply. Is that right? I'm not getting to all the other variables involved. Intervening variable, antecedent variable, z variable, you know, whatever, etc., etc. I'm not getting to it. Let's just keep it simple. We understand it in simply, and then when we go to more, you know, extensive discussion, we can talk about other variables, or, you know, as we discuss it in what, in, for example, essays or posting. All right. So having said that one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about geography of all three of them a little bit. All right. So geographic factor. For that one, I think the best thing to look at, political map just shows the size. You know, for our eye is easier to see. You can see the borders and everything else. All right. You can also see some general things, like, for example, look, in the Persian Gulf, which is the third, but, you know, not the least, but the most important one from American perspective, Iran, doesn't matter which regime is controlling it. If it's a friendly regime like the Shah of Iran, or if it's not so friendly regime like what? Islamic Republic of Iran, and I'm being diplomatic, is that right? It has the largest coastline. It has, you know, almost 1,200 what? You know, kilometers of what? 1,200 kilometers of, coastline with the Persian Gulf, which is right here, and what? Sea of Oman right there, okay? Then, when you look at the other great powers over there, Iraq. Actually, Iraq has a very small, you know, here we go. Let me see if I can make this one larger for you so you can see it a little bit better. Do you see that? Look at that tiny bitty amount of Persian Gulf, you know, is the coast of Iraq, okay? That is only 12 miles. 12 miles versus 1,200 miles. You see the difference? So what does that mean politically for us from a geographic perspective? Iran could always have a major navy. For Iraq, it's very easy to make Iraq to be a landlocked country. All right? And actually, that's exactly what happened during Iran-Iraq war. First, Iraqis were in Iranian territory. When in the second year, Iranians were pushing the Iraqis back into Iraq, they were able to capture this, like, you know, peninsula called Fao Peninsula, okay? And then they made Iraq to be a what? Landlocked country, because they captured the coastal area of what? Of Iraq. You see? So you need to think about all the great powers in the world. They have always had what? They have always had a navy. Navy is very, very important. Is that right? So then we go back. Here we go. We look at the other great power right here. Now notice Saudi Arabia actually has what? Coastline in the, you know, Red Sea as well. But as far as Persian Gulf is concerned, look at this. All the way from Kuwait down to what? To Qatar and UAE, that's the coastline of, you know, Saudi Arabia. So the largest coastline, that could be a question. Is that right? Which country in the Persian Gulf has the largest coast? Number one is Iran. Number two is Saudi what? Arabia. Look at tiny bitty Kuwait. Tiny bitty Kuwait, which is so much smaller than what? Then Iraq has 120 miles. 12 miles, 120 miles, 1,200 miles. You see the difference? Okay? So that shows you a whole lot about, you know, the politics that could be involved with that, and international politics of it too. Now, part of the geographic part is not just the size, it's also the what? The physical aspect. I love to show my students always a topographical map. And here we go. Look at what the topographical map shows about our three great you know, regional powers. It shows Saudi Arabia, which has a lot of, this is what we usually imagine the entire Middle East. Is that right? We think, oh, the Middle East is a desert. Well, yeah, if you want that one, yes. Saudi Arabia is a very good example. You see even Kuwait there, but I'm not going to talk too much about Kuwait right now because we're going to cover it out under part 2. And then you see Iraq there. You see the green part of Iraq is because of, you know, the basically nature's God, you know, the force, you know, gift of these two rivers. And that's where the Mesopotamian civilization developed. Is that right? Way before we call it Iraq. Iraq is a new name for that. Is that right? So, and then it was a part of actually the Persian Empire. Look at Iran, you see? mountains, this and that. You see a lot of green area. I'm not suggesting there were no desert here. There's a desert right there. There's a desert right here. But it's not, the desert are not the predominant what feature of that land. Lots of mountains are. Okay, you might say, wait a minute, how does this one affect Iranian politics and everything? It makes Iran, which is a part of what? Part of this Iranian plateau, okay, a territory basically surrounded by mountain, much more difficult to militarily defeat, okay, in the old-fashioned way with what? With armies. I'm not talking about, oh, attacking it with missiles or precision bombing or drones. No, I'm talking about what? You know, capturing it with land. Because bottom line, in a war, you win usually with what? Your army controls territory. Is that right? That's what we did in Europe. The army controlled Germany. The army controlled Italy. The army eventually, when we defeated Japanese, they controlled Japanese territory. You see what I mean? So that's what has happened. And when you look at the European history, you see that was always the case. All right. So this is much more challenging. That's why we try to shy away from a direct confrontation with them, because, you know, if they go to the defensive mode, then would cost us a lot more. So notice how geography can contribute already to what? To politics of the area. Then there is also history. All right. So what can we say about the history of it? The history of it, Iran is a new name, really. Okay, it came out in the 1930s when the Shah's father, Reza Shah, changed the name of the country from Persia. It was known as Persia, but technically Persia is only one part of Iran, is right here. Okay, the province of Persia. All right, that's where Cyrus the Great, whose name is in the Bible as a good guy, he went and defeated Babylonia in Iraq, saved the Jews. He's a nice guy. He declared the first human rights declaration, and you know, which is like a, you know, cylinder, and a copy of that cylinder is at the United Nations. All those things, and you know, is about the, you know, Persians who are from that province, but their language, their culture expanded, and a lot of other cultures and everybody else who is in Iran, they kind of take that as the dominant language, and then they have their own. Like, for example, in Iran, there are a lot of different ethnic groups. Persians are basically only 50% of the population. There are Kurds. I'm sure you have heard about Kurds. You have heard about Arabs. You have heard about Lurs. You have heard about Turkmens. You have heard about Azeris. Is that right? You've heard about Baluchis. These are all different ethnic groups. Like, for example, you can't go to Europe and say, okay, everybody is German. That's not true. Germans are in Germany, and there are also settlement of Germans, you know, in northern part of Switzerland, in, you know, in Austria, and maybe some other places here and there. But the entire place is not Germany, you know. Now, if a lot of people, they speak German, it's because it's a useful language, you know, for business and for other things. Same thing about France. You can't go and say, oh, well, French language was an international language before English, okay? So the whole, you know, Europe is some version of France. That's not true, okay? So you need to consider that the same way that there is tremendous amount of diversity in Europe, there's tremendous diversity in Iran, you know? And Iranians, you know, Iran has a territory that, you know, in the southwest of it, right here in this area, near actually Iraq and Kuwait, that there are mostly Arabs, but not the whole country are Arabs, okay? There are all those other ethnic groups that I told you, and their languages are completely different. Does this make any sense? I hope so. Okay, now what about Iraq? Iraq, as we mentioned, a new country. Iraq was basically, for most of its life, was a part of Persian Empire, all right? When the Ottoman Empire in Turkey started growing significantly, all right, then, you know, Iraq was, parts of it was part of, you know, Ottoman Empire, part of it was part of, you know, Persian Empire, all right? So it was in between. Then after World War I, when basically the Allies, they decided to divide the territories of Ottomans and some other, you know, powers. They lost the war, is that right? They created called Iraq, okay? So Iraq as a modern country is a very new country. Same is with Saudi Arabia, okay? There was, first of all, the name Saudi Arabia. Saudi is the name of the family that are running it, is that right? But actually the area was Arabia, Arabian Peninsula, all right? And that consisted of a lot of tribes. Now, what all of these tribes they have in common is ancestry. Their ancestry is Arabs. Now, some of them are Bedou Arabs, which are in, you know, Arabs who are in the what? who are actually in the desert, living in the desert. Some of them are city dwellers. All right. So for example, Kuwait City has had some. Mecca, that as you know, when we covered, we talked about, Prophet Muhammad and his family, and then Medina. You see what I mean? Here, let me put that part of it for you so you can see. Is that right? That part of the, actually Saudi Arabia, as you can see, a little bit greener. Why? It's not just desert, because it has mountains, and those mountains, they capture what? They capture the clouds coming out from here. You can see actually a little bit of a green right there too. You see? So a lot of the caravans used to go there, and then from here they would go to what? Remember, we have always talked about, for example, the caravan from east going to west or something, the Silk Road. I'm sure some of you have heard about Silk Road. Is that right? Okay. So that was part of it. And then, for example, in Bible, they talk about Frankenstein as one of those, basically fragrances that was very important and everything, and it has a very significant value. It was coming from this area, intertrade, going to the west, etc., etc. Okay. So now that you can see all those areas, you see that geography, very important. When we were invading Iraq, notice that we didn't invade Iraq from north, which is mountainous. That's where the Kurds in Iraq, they live. Even though they were our allies, is that right? We invaded invaded Iraq from the south. Why? Because it's desert, open area, easy to what? Access. In Iran, there are very little areas that are open access. The rest of it is mountainous, makes it very difficult. Saudi Arabia is also easier. That's why Saudis were so afraid of what? Saddam Hussein. They thought, okay, in 1990, Saddam Hussein took over what? Kuwait. It could also take over Saudi Arabia next and capture. See, in this area between Kuwait and Bahrain is the Saudi rich oil area, Al-Jabar areas and everything else. You see? So they had to, they were worried about that Saddam can take over all that stuff, the same way he took over Kuwait. All right. So all I said right here is a little bit about the geography part of it, the history part of it. As I mentioned, Saudi Arabia also didn't exist until after World War I. To this one, we can also add the socio-cultural one. Where does that one come from? Do you remember? We covered socio-cultural one and religion and everything. The culture of it, comes from that modules we have already covered. How about the economic condition one? Do you remember we focused on dollars, oil, development, those type of things? Here we go. Those are the factors that they come right here, play important role. What about the quality of the life? The quality of the life is the other dimension, you see? It's the other dimension of economic development. Economic development is not just by making people, ooh, my pocket is full of money. Economic development, the quality of the life part of it means, okay, how long am I going to live? Am I going to have a healthy lifestyle, or because of all the, I don't know, diseases in my area or other problems, or maybe the diet is not balanced. Okay, a diet which is from morning to night is just meat. Is that right? Not enough vegetables. Well, I guess you're going to have some problems. Is that right? Okay, you're eating a lot of meats and everything else. Well, your cholesterol is going to go up, which means you're going to have what? You're going to have a heart problem. Okay. Or for example, the amount of salt you're taking, because here people, they take a lot of salt in their food. Why? Because it's hot. You're constantly sweating. Okay? So we kind of like, your body kind of like craves for salty stuff. Okay? You drink a lot of water, you drink a lot of salt as well because you're losing it. So what happens? You see, if those things happen, they affect the quality of life. And let's face it, this area, people they had, because some of these areas, look, this area, the economy was basically consists of two things. In the area where you have water permanently, agriculture. In the areas there is not like permanent water, and then you have goats and sheep. And notice that in this part, it was not like the western part of America that are cows. Cow is a very large animal, and we have also had buffaloes. They're big animals. They eat a lot. The bigger you are, the more you eat to survive. Is that right? In the Middle East, because the resources are so limited, they don't move cows historically. What do they carry? Goats and sheep. When you read Bible, you see the same thing. They say, oh, all the prophets, they were basically sheep herders. Is that right? Some of them, they were near water, they would also capture fish. Okay? It doesn't matter, for example, if they were near the Mediterranean or the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf. That's it. So very, very what? Very, very different way of thinking about it. So I want you to understand that. And the people who had, goats and sheep, it was not always available to feed them during the winter. During the winter, you would go to the mountain areas which were colder, or higher areas were colder. There were still some green areas over there for your goats and sheep to eat it. And then during the winter time, you would come to the flats or the desert areas where there was still some little bit of a water left and a little bit of a what, some oasis here and there, and some greenery for your what, for your animals, because you need your animals for several things. Number one, you need their meat. Okay. Number two, when you kill them and then you eat the meat, also nothing goes for waste. Okay. Traditionally, their skin, you can make clothes from it, you can make shoes from it, you can do this, you can do that, you can make some tools from parts of the animal. Nothing goes for waste. Okay. Traditionally. And then, of course, from the same animal that you don't kill, because you can divide them into two groups. The groups that are very good in giving us milk, the groups that are very, very good in just their meat. Their meat is tender. All right. So the one with the milk, it doesn't matter if it's a sheep or a goat, you can get milk. And from that milk, you can make yogurt and cheese and this and that and other dairy products. Does this make any sense? Is that all right? Okay, so we covered those areas, as you can see. Then there is the political development, which, as I mentioned, well, there are countries like Iran. There are three countries in that part of the world that have a very ancient history. Iran, basically Turkey, and Egypt. Is that right? Do you remember when we were focusing on the leadership? I covered three cases from each one of those, and then Professor James Bill's chapter also focused on the leadership from those. Okay. We wanted to tell you why we did that. We did that one because those are the three prominent ones, okay, with the extended history. The rest of them are relatively new. There used to be, basically there are tribal societies that the tribe used to lead them, and the tribe had a territory of their own. And guess what? Before Islam, these tribes were not even in a good relationship with one another. They were constantly fighting. So what happened was one of the two factors was controlling their population. One factor was lack of development. What happens? That's why a lot of farmers and nomads, they would go for having as many children as possible, because you would shoot for 8 kids. Out of 8 kids, if you were lucky, 2 of them would survive past the age of 10. Most of the children would die before they become double digit. Why? Because at that time, there was no introduction of penicillin, there was no vaccination. So diseases like smallpox, is that right? Polio, and similar problems, what? Measles, those things, they would kill people. Not a joke. That's one. 2, one of the other things that causes human beings die is infection. With the discovery of penicillin and the promotion of it and development of it further, introduction of penicillin in form of antibiotics, when the kids, and you see, we have had it all as kids. We have seen it in our sibling having it. We see it in our own kids, and we see it in our, cousins and relatives. When they get sick, what do they give them? Antibiotic. Well, antibiotic kills bacteria. It doesn't kill virus. Is that right? But that still allows a lot of people that before would die to survive. So what has happened here is, population would grow. What was controlling that population? 2 factors. Number 1, natural reasons, which, as I mentioned, it was controlled by only the strongest children would survive. The weakest children would die. Rule of jungle, just like any other animals in this, planet. That's one. The second one was because there was a lot of fighting among the tribes. I'm talking about pre-Islamic period. When Islam came, Prophet Muhammad basically united all Arabia and all the tribes. Little by little, they became all Muslim. Well, Muslims are not supposed to kill Muslim. Operative word, not supposed to. Is that right? So during his time, after he united everybody, he established that one, then the Islamic, state from what? From Medina, they started going to what? To include the entire, what? Peninsula. So here, the peninsula is united. We still have the developmental problem of there is no vaccination, there is no penicillin, but because they're not fighting among themselves, what happens? Population grows. Population grows. What do you need? You need to feed your people. What happens? You need to expand. You see the political science perspective on that? So this is very different from other ways of looking at it. The religion, they wanted to expand the religion. Well, one of the things they did was they started growing west and east. East was Persian Empire. West was Roman Empire. Okay? So this group of united Arab tribes, they were able to defeat the two major superpowers of the time. They basically grabbed all of the territories that the Romans had and all of the territories that the Persians had, and eventually they defeated both of them. You see? For all practical purposes. Roman Empire, which was so much into Asia, had to go retreat all the way back to Europe. You see? And then when Ottoman took over, actually took all the way the power to what? To Vienna. You see what I mean? The gate of Vienna. So, and that's where basically Ottoman Empire stopped. All right. So as you can see right here, political development is another dimension of what we need to talk about. Military, development also goes kind of hand in hand with that one. Persians, because of their having an empire, they were used to running a big show. Okay. So they've always had a, pretty well organized military under different systems. Is that right? Then, of course, Ottomans also, okay, when they took over the basically Islamic Empire, the tribes in Arabia, when they, Islamic, states, they came divided between Ottomans and the Persians and everything. It was not a major power anymore. Again, it went back to tribes, and the tribes were limited resources. What's a limited resource? Number one, you need water. So oases are very important. Notice, there is no really river there. There's no continuous river there. There are some what? There are some, seasonal rivers, but there are not rivers there. So what do? So the wells are very important. The oases are very important. And here we go. The population is growing. So sometimes they were fighting over those limited resources. I want you to understand that. That's a very important thing. It was population. So that's how they expanded toward other areas, especially other areas that they had access to fresh water. Like what? Like what now we call Iraq, which was, as I mentioned, divided between the Persians and the Romans, is that right? And then later on, when the Romans were already pushed all the way back to Europe, between the Ottomans and what? Persians. Does this make any sense? Okay. So along with that one, then there is the foreign policy, where the foreign policy of these countries, which I focus more on the course of international politics of the Middle East, it has been playing a very interesting role. There was a time that these countries, they had to just worry about their regional powers, which their regional powers were the superpower of the time, okay? If it was Persia, it was Ottoman, it was Egypt, you see? Those were the power. Then after the modernization of Europe and, basically Enlightenment, and Europe became what? A major military power, those, European countries, they were looking for either colonies or places that they can take over. They started sending their ship right here. Originally, they didn't come to the what? Persian Gulf for oil. When, for example, the Portuguese, they took, here we go, Portuguese, they took over the island of Kesh from Iran. Or, for example, the other, European powers took over a bunch of those islands. Do you know what was Persian Gulf famous for? Not for oil. It was famous for pearl. Persian Gulf had a very, very famous pearl industry. Okay? But what happened was Persian Gulf pearl industry disappeared. When? By the end of the 19th century, beginning of 20th century, when the Japanese, they developed artificial pearl. So they started having what? They started having basically oysters that they could create pearl that are all the same size, all the same color, all the same this, all the same that. So they basically bankrupted what? The natural pearls of the Persian Gulf. Now, still, the pearl industry is important there. And the Persian Gulf, pearls, they still have a value, but for a particular market, you see? But most of the pearls that you see around the world is either are 100%, artificial, is that right? They're made of artificial things, some form of plastic or something, or if they are from the oyster, it coming from the technology that the Japanese, they developed. And that technology expanded to the other Asian countries and everything. So nobody nowadays knows Persian Gulf as a what? Producer of a pearl in the world. But that was one of their things. Just same as this area was very famous for Frankenstein, as that what? As Frankenstein that, is mentioned in the Bible. All right. So, as you see, global politics changes, and along with that one, everything else changed. Okay, when the Cold War started, these countries in the area, is that right? The great ones, they had to make a decision where they wanted to go. Iran under the Shah, Reza Shah Pahlavi, the first king of the Pahlavi dynasty, and Pahlavi dynasty was the last dynasty that Iran had before it becomes, after revolution becomes Islamic Republic. Is that right? Reza Shah thought, hey, I can become like the Switzerland of the, Middle East, I have access to the Russian, and then the British are there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to declare neutrality. And he was not sure. Remember that the Russian army was trying to defend this part of the Soviet Union, which has a lot of oil and everything, against what? Against the Nazis, because the Nazis were coming there. You see? So he thought, okay, how about if the Nazis, they win this one? I don't want it to what? I don't want to make them angry. So he did trade with the Germans. He invited the German, engineers to come and build a trans-Iranian railroad. Is that right? And the Allied forces were very smart. They waited until the Germans, they built the trans-Iranian railroad which connects the Persian Gulf all the way to the Caspian Sea. Is that right? And then they invaded Iran. So the Soviets from the north and the British from Iraq and the Persian Gulf invaded Iran. They forced the Reza Shah to abdicate and put his young son. How old is the Mohammad Reza Shah? His son, the last king of Iran. Okay, he was like about 21 years old. Is that right? What is 21? 21, we basically start drinking legally in this country. Is that right? They made him to be a king of Iran. And, of course, the politics of it was he learned that, hey, I have to take a side. The Soviets have taken, because, he knew the history of Persia, that all these countries right there, is that right? All these what we call Istans, that they were part of Soviet Union. They were all part of the Persian Empire, Afghanistan, part of Iraq, part of these areas right there, Azerbaijan, this and that. That was divided between the Persians and what? Ottomans, okay? So he was very afraid that, hey, the Soviets are going to come and eventually what? Take over. So he had a fear of the communists. And actually his fear came out kind of true, because in 1946, after everybody left, because they signed a tripartite agreement between, the Russians, the British, and the Americans, they were supposed to call Iran the Bridge of Victory, because it was because of that same railroad that the Germans built, is that right? That we were able to supply the Soviet, army with, equipment and everything, so they can withstand what? They can withstand with the guns we are giving them, with tires we were giving them, with food we were giving them, with all the other supplies we were giving them. An army cannot fight without supplies, guys, okay? I'm sure you know that one. It takes without going. Is that right? So they said, okay, well, we thank them and then we leave. Guess what? The Soviets would not wanted to leave the Iranian part of Azerbaijan. You see that Azerbaijan? This is only 1/4 of Azerbaijan. The rest of Azerbaijan is in Iran, okay? They were trying to capture that one. With the help of the allies and a very, very smart Iranian prime minister at the time, Iran was able to what? Diffuse the support of the Soviets, of the local people who had rebelled against the central government in Iran, and Iran what? Escaped that. Basically, what the prime minister suggested was this. He knew that the Russians, they wanted the oil facilities over there. He signed with them an agreement. He said, oh, we give all the control of this area to the Russians, this and that. But, we have to pass it to our parliament. He knew that the Iranian parliament at the time was not going to sign it, but the Russians didn't know. They thought, okay, if this government does that, probably the parliament is going to what? Stamp it. And then so guess what? When it did the parliament didn't accept it. The Russians had already left, but they were leaving, weapons and everything for what? For their local people to fight against the Iranian what? Army. And the Iranian army got some supplies from the Americans, and they was able to what? Defeat those people, and then what? Again, reunite that section with the rest of Iran. After that, Shah was afraid of what? Of the communists and, Soviets quite a bit. So among all his allies, even with domestic people, he was afraid of the local Communist Party, okay? And he was also afraid of the Soviets, so he could get closer and closer and closer and closer and closer to the what? To the West. Iraq had a different, history, as you have seen it. Is that right? You have seen in those sections, first separated, and it was a kingdom of the Faisal and Hashemites and everything over there, King Faisal, that, basically the British basically promised every head of the tribes of Arabs that they fought against Ottoman, oh, we are going to give you a country. We're going to give you a country. So one of the countries was Iraq. Another one was, Jordan. Another one was basically became Saudi Arabia. All of these were basically, they were not Oman, they were not this, they were not that. Those are all what created. UAE, is that right? United Arab Emirates. There were like 7 different sheikdoms right there, you see? So these are all, we're going to talk about this one a little bit more detail in later on. But I wanted to tell you that the countries that they have more of a history, they have more of an identity. The one that they have less of a history, they have a different type of politics, you see? The politics could be, I'm not saying that they're not powerful. We are not, we are not saying Saudi Arabia is not, is not powerful. Saudi Arabia in OPEC is a balancer. It's a country that produces so much oil that it can increase the production, and what? When you increase the production, supplies is so much, the price comes down. When the, and sometimes it can what? Decrease the production, and what? The price goes up. So Saudi Arabia has tremendous amount of power in that regard. Okay, don't underestimate it. Yes, it's a country with basically, one major commodity, oil, and you can add gas to it too, because oil and gas, they come together in some ways. Is that right? But with that one commodity, it's a commodity the world depends on it now. Okay, so don't underestimate that. Iraq and Iran, in addition to oil, they've had agriculture and a lot of other products, industrial stuff and everything else. And Saudi Arabia is trying to industrialize and try to establish what we call basically a more and less balanced economy. But still, most of their government revenue comes from what? Oil. Okay? So, of course, Saudi Arabia, in terms of the East-West, decided to be with the West. Is that right? Saudi Arabia never had really much of a relationship with Soviet Union. It was after the Soviets, they fell apart, that started having some relationship with Russian Federation and Eastern European countries, okay? Iraq, for a while, as I mentioned, it had the kingdom, and then when the coup d'etat happens over there, and they kill the king and everything else, is that right? The Ba'ath regime comes over there, the history of it is written in those sections I have for you. Sometimes they flirted with the idea of socialism, sometimes they flirted with the idea of nationalism, is that right? And then eventually Saddam Hussein took over, and you remember what he did. First he united his country, and he tried to get rid of any opposition, Shiites in the south, Kurds in the north. He even used chemical weapons against both of those groups and everything else. Then he fought with Iran for 8 years, and then eventually, he gave the land back to Iran. He won some pieces of land, and he gave back to Iran, and then he invaded. He said, well, Iran, how much of a benefit does it have for me? Let me go and what? Rob a bank. What's the bank? Kuwait. Okay? Kuwaitis had given him a lot of loans. Okay? Kuwaitis have used a lot of their ports to import, basically, and receive weapons and, what do you call it, economic, products for Iraq. And how does he thank them? He captures them. Is that right? 1990, and then, as you know, what we end up doing right there. Okay, so here we go. We can talk more about this one when we talk about that. And in fact, Saddam Hussein was referring to Kuwait as the 19th province of Iraq. Why? Because when Iraq was a part of the Ottoman Empire, of course you choose the part of history that helps you, is that right? When Iraq was a part of the Ottoman Empire, Kuwait was connected to that Iraq part. So he was saying, oh, this is actually a part of my country. That's it. So as you can see, a lot of these political issues, military issues with their economic factors and socio-economic ones, they kind of are related. But what I did for you with these 9 variables right there, trying to show you what can happen, what can happen when you try to dissect them, because each one of them is a different cause. Yes, they are related to other one, but a different cause. Notice that I didn't say much about the prospect for future, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that one when we discuss what? The other states, because their politics is not any separated from what? the politics of the others. Okay, and that's what we are going to do. But today we covered, my goodness gracious, the video was, I was trying to hope to keep it with about 30 minutes, but I think it's about 40 or maybe even 45 minutes. We did the best we can, it was all right, to try to make a lot of sense out of a lot of information for you. I hope that if you have any question, as always, what do? You email me. Thank you.